All right, so today I'm going to be continuing with my reading of Erich Fromm's Marx's Concept of Man, and today we're going to be reading Chapter 2, which is called Marx's Historical Materialism. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about this text and what makes it stand out as a monograph on Karl Marx, I've made a video about that topic and also written an article about this book. You can find the video on my YouTube channel, the article on my Substack. I've put links to both of those in the description box below, as well as links to the original text itself. If you enjoy this video, be sure to let me know by leaving a like and, even better, a comment where you can feel free to share your thoughts on the material being discussed today. If you know of anyone else who might enjoy this content, please consider sharing it with them, and if you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe to this channel so that way you never miss another video. So with all of that out of the way, let's get started. Marx's Concept of Man by Erich Fromm, Chapter 2, Marx's Historical Materialism. The first hurdle to be cleared in order to arrive at a proper understanding of Marx's philosophy is the misunderstanding of the concept of materialism and historical materialism. Those who believe this to be a philosophy claiming that man's material interest, his wish for ever increasing material gain and comforts, are his main motivation, forget the simple fact that the words idealism and materialism, as used by Marx and all other philosophers, have nothing to do with psychic motivations of a higher spiritual level as against those of a lower and baser kind. In philosophical terminology, materialism or naturalism refers to a philosophic view which holds that matter in motion is the fundamental constituent of the universe. In this sense, the Greek pre-Socratic philosophers were materialists, although they were by no means materialists in the above-mentioned sense of the word as a value judgment or ethical principle. By idealism, on the contrary, a philosophy is understood in which it is not the ever-changing world of the senses that constitutes reality, but incorporeal essences or ideas. Plato's system is the first philosophical system to which the name of idealism was applied. While Marx was, in the philosophical sense, a materialist in ontology, he was not even really interested in such questions, and hardly ever dealt with them. However, there are many kinds of materialist and idealist philosophies, and in order to understand Marx's materialism, we have to go beyond the general definition just given. Marx actually took a firm position against a philosophical materialism, which was current among many of the most progressive thinkers, especially natural scientists, of his time. This materialism claimed that the substratum of all mental and spiritual phenomena was to be found in matter and material processes. In its most vulgar and superficial form, this kind of materialism taught that feelings and ideas are sufficiently explained as results of chemical bodily processes, and thought is to the brain what urine is to the kidneys. Marx fought this type of mechanical bourgeois materialism, the abstract materialism of natural science that excludes history and its process, and postulated instead what he called in the economic and philosophical manuscripts naturalism or humanism, which is distinguished from both idealism and materialism, and at the same time constitutes their unifying truth. In fact, Marx never used the terms historical materialism or dialectic materialism. He did speak of his own dialectical method in contrast with that of Hegel and of its materialistic basis, by which he simply referred to the fundamental conditions of human existence. This aspect of materialism, Marx's materialist method, which distinguishes his view from that of Hegel, involves the study of the real economic and social life of man and of the influence of man's actual way of life on this thinking and feeling. In direct contrast to German philosophy, Marx wrote, which descends from heaven to earth, here we ascend from earth to heaven. That is to say, we do not set out from what men imagine, conceive, nor from men as narrated, thought of, or imagined, conceived, in order to arrive at men in the flesh. We set out from real, active men, and on the basis of their real life process, we demonstrate the development of the ideological reflexes and echoes of this life process. And that is a quote from Karl Marx's German ideology. Marx and Engels is the German ideology. Also one of my favorite quotes from one of the best books in Marx's anthology that clearly articulates this idea of historical materialism that Fromm is talking about. Continuing. Or, as he puts it in a slightly different way, Hegel's philosophy of history is nothing but the philosophical expression of the Christian Germanic dogma concerning the contradiction between spirit and matter, God and the world. Hegel's philosophy of history presupposes an abstract or absolute spirit, which develops in such a way that mankind is only a mass which carries this spirit, consciously or unconsciously. Hegel assumes that a speculative, esoterical history precedes and underlies empirical history. The history of mankind is transformed into the history of the abstract spirit of mankind, which transcends the real man. This is from Marx and Engels' The Holy Family. I think that came out, or that was written rather. It was written about a year before the German ideology, but around the same era of Marx's thought. Continuing. Marx described his own historical method very succinctly. The way in which men produce their means of subsistence depends first of all on the nature of the actual means they find in existence and have to reproduce. This mode of production must not be considered simply as being the reproduction of the physical existence of the individuals. Rather, it is a definite form of activity of these individuals, a definite form of expressing their life, a definite mode of life on their part. As individuals express their life, so they are. What they are, therefore, coincides with their production, both with what they produce and with how they produce. The nature of individuals thus depends on the material conditions determining their production. This quote is from the German ideology. Marx made the difference between historical materialism and contemporary materialism very clear in his thesis on Feuerbach. The chief defect of all materialism up to now, including Feuerbach's, is that the object, reality, what we apprehend through our senses, is understood only in the form of the object or contemplation, but not as sensuous human activity, as practice, not subjectively. Hence, in opposition to materialism, the active side was developed abstractly by idealism, which of course does not know real sensuous activity as such. Feuerbach wants sensuous objects really distinguished from the objects of thought, but he does not understand human activity itself as objective activity, and that is thesis 1 of the theses on Feuerbach. Marx, like Hegel, looks at an object in its movement, in its becoming, and not as a static object, which can be explained by discovering the physical cause of it. In contrast to Hegel, Marx studies man and history by beginning with the real man and the economic and social conditions under which he must live, and not primarily with his ideas. Marx was as far from bourgeois materialism as he was from Hegel's idealism. Hence, he could rightly say that his philosophy is neither idealism nor materialism, but a synthesis, humanism and naturalism. It should be clear by now why the popular idea of the nature of historical materialism is erroneous. The popular view assumes that in Marx's opinion, the strongest psychological motive in man is to gain money and to have more material comfort. If this is the main force within man, so continues this interpretation of historical materialism. The key to the understanding of history is the material desires of men. Hence, the key to the explanation of history is man's belly and his greed for material satisfaction. The fundamental misunderstanding on which this interpretation rests is the assumption that historical materialism is a psychological theory which deals with man's drives and passions. But in fact, historical materialism is not at all a psychological theory. It claims that the way man produces determines his thinking and his desires, and not that his main desires are those for maximal material gain. Economy in this context refers not to a psychic drive, but to the mode of production, not to a subjective, psychological, but to an objective, economic, sociological factor. The only quasi-psychological premise in the theory lies in the assumption that man needs food, shelter, etc., hence needs to produce. Hence that the mode of production, which depends on a number of objective factors, comes first, as it were, and determines the other spheres of his activities. The objectively given conditions which determine the mode of production, and hence social organization, determine man, his ideas as well as his interests. In fact, the idea that institutions form men, as Montesquieu put it, was an old insight. What was new in Marx was his detailed analysis of institutions as being rooted in the mode of production and the productive forces underlying it. Certain economic conditions, like those of capitalism, produce as a chief incentive the desire for money and property. Other economic conditions can produce exactly the opposite desires, like those of asceticism and contempt for earthly riches, as we find them in many Eastern cultures and in the early stages of capitalism. And Fromm has a footnote here that I want to read. It's a quote from Volume 1 of Capital. The quote is, "While the capitalist of the classical type brands individual consumption as a vice against his function of abstinence from accumulating, the modernized capitalist is capable of looking upon accumulation as abstinence from pleasure." So I'm going to go back and just reread the sentence that footnote was appended to, and then we'll get back into the text. Certain economic conditions, like those of capitalism, produce as a chief incentive the desire for money and property. Other economic conditions can produce exactly the opposite desires, like those of asceticism and contempt for earthly riches, as we find them in many Eastern cultures and in the early stages of capitalism. The passion for money and property, according to Marx, is just as much economically conditioned as the opposite passions. Marx's materialistic or economic interpretation of history has nothing whatsoever to do with an alleged materialistic or economic striving as the most fundamental drive in man. It does mean that man, the real and total man, the real living individuals, not the ideas produced by these individuals, are the subject matter of history and of the understanding of its laws. Marx's interpretation of history could be called an anthropological interpretation of history if one wanted to avoid the ambiguities of the words materialistic and economic. It is the understanding of history based on the fact that men are the authors and actors of their history. And it's interesting that Fromm says that if we wanted to, as he puts it, avoid the ambiguities of the words materialistic and economic, that we could call Marx's interpretation of history anthropological. And I say that's interesting because I just recently read a short introduction to Marx by Terry Eagleton. It's from the Routledge Classic Philosophers series. Really, really great introduction. Very short, succinct, and very accessible intro to Marx. And one of the chapters in this very short book is called is just called anthropology. Each chapter is called like history, philosophy, anthropology. He's looking at Marx through these various lenses. Begins with him as a historian, continues with him as an anthropologist, and so on. So, just a quick side note there that it's interesting to see a couple of different authors look at Marx through a variety of lenses in terms of like how to actually contextualize him as a thinker. Is he a philosopher? Is he an economist, a political theorist, an anthropologist, or maybe some combination of all of these and perhaps a few others? Continuing. In fact, it is one of the great differences between Marx and most writers of the 18th and 19th centuries that he does not consider capitalism to be the outcome of human nature, and the motivation of man in capitalism to be the universal motivation within man. The absurdity of the view that Marx thought the drive for maximal profit was the deepest motive in man becomes all the more apparent when one takes into account that Marx made some very direct statements about human drives. He differentiated between constant or fixed drives, which exist under all circumstances and which can be changed by social conditions only as far as form and direction are concerned, and relative drives, which owe their origin only to a certain type of social organization. Marx assumed sex and hunger to fall under the category of fixed drives, but it never occurred to him to consider the drive for maximal economic gain as a constant drive. But it hardly needs such proof from Marx's psychological ideas to show that the popular assumption about Marx's materialism is utterly wrong. Marx's whole criticism of capitalism is exactly that it has made interest in money and material gain the main motive in man, and his concept of socialism is precisely that of a society in which this material interest would cease to be the dominant one. This will be even clearer later on when we discuss Marx's concept of human emancipation and of freedom in detail. As I emphasized before, Marx starts out with man who makes his own history. The first premise of all human history is, of course, the existence of living human individuals. Thus, the first fact to be established is the physical organization of these individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature. Of course, we cannot here go either into the actual physical nature of man or into the natural conditions in which man finds himself, geological, orohydrographical, climatic, and so on. The writing of history must always set out from these natural bases and their modification in the course of history through the action of man. Men can be distinguished from animals by consciousness, by religion, or anything else you like. They themselves begin to produce their means of subsistence, a step which is conditioned by their physical organization. By producing their means of subsistence, men are indirectly producing their actual material life. That is also from the German Ideology, and it's a quote that I read in one of the first videos in my long series on the theses on Feuerbach. I think it's probably in the first video on Thesis 1. It's around a half an hour long. Pretty sure this quote comes up in that video. I talk a lot about why this is so significant, but I'll just really quick, if you're confused, like what does he mean man produces means of subsistence? When Marx talks about that, he's talking about how human beings make the things that make the things they need. So not just producing the things we need, but also that we produce the technologies and the methods, the procedures that we use to develop, build, create, maintain the things that we need for survival or subsistence. And the whole bit about men being distinguished from animals or consciousness, that's kind of more of a dig at Feuerbach, or more of a reference rather to Feuerbach. I think, personally, I'm pretty sure he's got Feuerbach on his mind when he's writing that. But again, I go into a lot more detail about this quote in that video about the theses on Feuerbach. So if you're curious and you want to learn more about that and how this factors into Marx's development of historical materialism, I'll put a link to that video in the description as well. Continuing, it is very important to understand Marx's fundamental idea. Man makes his own history. He is his own creator. Well, quick side note, I hope that at some point Fromm finishes that thought, because he seems like he's referring to a pretty famous quote of Marx's, but he's leaving out the a very important second half, which is man makes his own history, but he does not make it as he pleases. But it's been a long time since I've read this book. Maybe he does bring that up at some point, but hopefully he does, because it's kind of important. It is very important to understand Marx's fundamental idea. Man makes his own history. He is his own creator. As he put it many years later in Capital, and would not such a history be easier to compile, since, as Vico says, human history differs from natural history in this, that we have made the former, but not the latter. Man gives birth to himself in the process of history. The essential factor in this process of self-creation of the human race lies in its relationship to nature. Man, at the beginning of his history, is blindly bound or chained to nature. In the process of evolution, he transforms his relationship to nature and hence himself. Marx has more to say in Capital about this dependence on nature. Those ancient social organisms of production are, as compared with bourgeois society, extremely simple and transparent. But they are founded either on the immature development of man individually, who has not yet severed the umbilical cord that unites him with his fellow men in a primitive tribal community, or upon direct relations of subjection. They can arise and exist only when the development of the productive power of labor has not risen beyond a low stage, and when, therefore, the social relations within the sphere of material life, between man and between man and nature, are correspondingly narrow. This narrowness is reflected in the ancient worship of nature, capital N, and in the other elements of the popular religions. The religious reflex of the real world can, in any case, only then finally vanish when the practical relations of everyday life offer to man none but perfectly intelligible and reasonable relations with regard to his fellow men and to nature. The life process of society, which is based on the process of material production, does not strip off its mystical veil until it is treated as production by freely associated men, and is consciously regulated by them in accordance with a settled plan. This, however, demands for society a certain material groundwork or set of conditions of existence, which in their turn are the spontaneous product of a long and painful process of development. That's from Capital, as Fromm already said. I was just going to point out that there's quite a few things in this long quote that call to mind some of the earlier works of Marx, with which I think I've said this many times. I'm more familiar with his earlier writings, way before he wrote Capital. But it's interesting to see ideas from like the contributions to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right coming up in here. Again, ideas from Theses on Feuerbach. Particularly, I was thinking about the contribution to the critique, which heavily emphasizes the idea that the problems to which religion is ostensibly supposed to respond are only going to be resolved, from Marx's point of view, when society is improved. And he's saying this in opposition to a lot of other people at that time who thought that the main problem was religion. And Marx was kind of like, well, no, actually, religion is a solution for people, and we need to solve the problems that are there that religion is rising in response to. Not tell people to give up their religion before we've solved the problems that they're using it to deal with and navigate. Which is, I think, kind of mind-blowing to a lot of people, because a lot of people, they associate Marx with being staunchly anti-religious. I actually don't read Marx as being very anti-religious, as much as he believes that the problems that are present in society are specifically that. They are social problems, they are real problems, economic problems. And asking people to give up their religion, as some of his friends like Bruno Bauer were trying to do, for Marx was essentially putting the cart before the horse. Or as Marx very vividly put it in the contributions to the critique, you're asking men to give up their illusions when they're still in a condition that requires illusions. I'm probably butchering that quote a little bit. But point being, it's always interesting to me to see when we look at works from later points in Marx's career and we're able to tie back, earlier ideas that he was, fleshing out many years prior. And I'm interjecting here a little bit more because I feel like there's things that I wish Fromm would maybe expand on a little bit more. That like I'm rereading this for the first time in many years, and I'm finding it a little bit repetitive, and I'm finding a couple points where I'm like, I feel like you should have expanded on certain things a little bit more. But I also might just be digressing just because I like Marx and I enjoy tracing his intellectual development. So, but I'll try to temper the interjections to not get too carried away with them. And we're almost done with the chapter. So, continuing. In this statement, again referring back to the quote from Capital, Marx speaks of an element which has a central role in his theory: labor. Labor is the factor which mediates between man and nature. Labor is man's efforts to regulate his metabolism with nature. Labor is the expression of human life, and through labor, man's relationship to nature is changed. Hence, through labor, man changes himself. More about his concept of labor will be said later on. I will conclude this section by quoting Marx's most complete formulation of the concept of historical materialism, written in 1859. And then this is the quote. The general result at which I arrived, and which, once won, served as a guiding thread for my studies, can be briefly formulated as follows. In the social production of their life, men enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will, relations of production which correspond to a definite stage of development of their material productive forces. The sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation, on which rises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their social being, but, on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. At a certain stage of their development, the material productive forces of society come in conflict with the existing relations of production, or what is but a legal expression for the same thing, with the property relations within which they have been at work hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an epoch of social revolution. With the change of the economic foundations, the entire immense superstructure is more or less rapidly transformed. In considering such transformations, a distinction should always be made between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, and the legal, political, religious, aesthetic, or philosophic, in short, ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. Just as our opinion of an individual is not based on what he thinks of himself, so we cannot judge of such a period of transformation by its own consciousness. On the contrary, this consciousness must be explained rather from the contradictions of material life, from the existing conflict between the social productive forces and the relations of production. No social order ever perishes before all the productive forces for which there is room in it have developed, and new, higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society itself. Therefore, mankind always sets itself only such tasks as it can solve, since, looking at the matter more closely, it will always be found that the task itself arises only when the material conditions for its solution already exist, or are at least in the process of formation. In broad outlines, Asiatic, ancient, feudal, and modern bourgeois modes of production, can be designated as progressive epochs in the economic formation of society. The bourgeois relations of production are the last antagonistic form of the social process of production. Antagonistic not in the sense of individual antagonism, but of one arising from the social conditions of life of the individual. At the same time, the productive forces developing in the womb of bourgeois society create the material conditions for the solution of that antagonism. This social formation brings, therefore, the prehistory of human society to a close. That is a quote from Preface to a Contribution to a Critique of Political Economy, as Fromm, I don't think he named the text specifically, but he described that, in his view, as the most succinct explanation of historical materialism. There's one last paragraph. This is just from Fromm. It will be useful again to underscore and elaborate on some specific notions in this theory. First of all, Marx's concept of historical change. Change is due to the contradiction between the productive forces and other objectively given conditions and the existing social organization. When a mode of production or social organization hampers rather than furthers the given productive forces, a society, if it is not to collapse, will choose such forms of production as fit the new set of productive forces and develop them. The evolution of man in all history is characterized by man's struggle with nature. At one point of history, and according to Marx in the near future, man will have developed the productive sources of nature to such an extent that the antagonism between man and nature can be eventually solved. At this point, the prehistory of man will come to a close, and truly human history will begin. That's the end of Chapter 2, Marx's Historical Materialism. Next time we will read Chapter 3, The Problem of Consciousness, Social Structure, and the Use of Force. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for listening. Let me know what you thought about this chapter in the comments below. And until next time, thanks.